Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs and members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your Master of Fun and Wonder, your Sommelier of Cinema, your Viceroy of Verisimilitude, your Archbishop of Banterbury, your Chancellor of Cheerfulness, and by God, your existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, Robert Meyer Burnett. And here I am. Once again, I am what? Robcasting at you imagination connoisseurs, from the Robservatory, someplace where I, honestly, to be quite honest, I barely get out of here. I'm here. I feel like I'm here all the time, and my days are separated into work and editorial and YouTube shows, and work and editorial and YouTube shows. It's truly what I do. I do a show, I jump off, I edit, do some work, jump on another show, jump off the show, edit, do some work, rinse, repeat, forever. Which isn't a bad thing. I feel productive, which is good. and it keeps me frosty to talk to all of you imagination connoisseurs, all of you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity. But you know, I want to start this show by, I want to address something that keeps coming up. Most recently, it came up, a half an hour ago when I read a post from Jordy Lyons, our moderator Jordy, and he was pointing out that there was a video on Andy Signore's channel, Popcorned Planet, which was another in a number of videos I've seen that was, well, it was a hit piece. It was an attack piece on John Campea. And he was on last week with Aaron talking about what it means to have a female-centric Star Wars movie and about that announcement. John has taken a lot of guff from various other online sources, people I like, people whose shows I've been on, and a lot of other people whose shows I haven't been on and really don't know. But it was a kerfluffle, absolutely. And the gist of it is that John somehow got pwned by some woman that was on his show. And the funny thing to me is, having just watched Andy Signore's piece, he did a whole 15-minute video on it. Aaron Cummings, who's on that show, Aaron is a series regular on the John Campea show. John has known her for years. She starred in John's movie. She's been a regular on the show, a rotating guest, for months and months now. And the reason that John has Aaron on his show is specifically because she is a smart commentator that has a lot to say that will sometimes disagree with John, if not always, or if not frequently. She certainly disagreed with me. So the entire point of having someone like Aaron on John's show is to have healthy debate. So if John says something that Aaron disagrees with, or vehemently disagrees with, and they get into it, that's what's supposed to happen. That's what the show's about. I disagree with John too. But because it's very interesting, everyone's trying to paint it like John was owned by the woman that was on his show, without understanding that Aaron is a regular on the show. And the whole point of having her there is to get into these kinds of debates. What I find really interesting is someone wants to paint it that John was owned by a woman, as instead of the series regular that John has on his show specifically to offer alternative points of view. So the very thing that people are skewering John about, by skewering John for it, they're the same people that are reinforcing the very thing that they're complaining about. How about does John get any credit for having, a female commentator who's whip smart, incredibly witty, can speak off the cuff on a number of, just about every other subject, and is very opinionated? He doesn't get credit for having her as a series regular on his show for that very reason? They get into one kerfluffle about a Star Wars show, and suddenly people are talking about that John got owned? I don't think so. I think that John's a pretty smart cookie for having somebody like Aaron on his show in the first place. Anyway, just my 2 cents on that one. Since it's come up a lot, and people have talked to me about it a lot, I figured I'd weigh in on it. Especially, I love it when people like that who don't have female commentators on their show, or don't have regular guest hosts that are female, are casting these dispersions. So, anyway, just something to think about. I'll tell you what else there is to think about. Today, my friends, is a day worthy of celebration. While everybody was talking about, ooh, May the 4th be with you. I don't know what that means. There's never been a Star Wars movie released on the 4th. I, of course, remember when Star Wars was released on the 25th, or Empire Strikes Back on, the 21st. I was there, saw it that day, and, May the 4th be with you. Don't even know what that means. Today, however, no, it's not Revenge of the 5th. No, it's the revenge of Maximus Decimus Meridius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and he had his vengeance, both in this life and the next. 20 years ago today, ladies and gentlemen, it is the 20th anniversary of Ridley Scott's Gladiator today. Now, I was going to bring them out. I forgot. I have multiple copies of Gladiator on Blu-ray. I've got a Steelbook. I've got the Blue Sapphire or whatever, the Sapphire edition from Paramount. I've got like 3 other editions of Gladiator. I don't have as many editions of Gladiator as Dieter Bastian has of Catching Fire or The Hunger Games. But I have a lot. I love Gladiator. As a matter of fact, when I was married, and we used to have parties at my house all the time, anybody new would have to listen to my sound system, and I had it perfectly calibrated in the room, and I would play the Battle of Germania from the beginning of Gladiator over and over again and make people endure ear-splitting volumes, because it was the most perfectly balanced room. It was a wood room, all wood room, and I had all the speakers. It was a 7.1 system, and boy, was it fun to have. Let me tell you, I love this movie. I love Gladiator, and I think it's terrific, and it did win Best Picture. But now, like with so many other things, many people are now, they're reassessing it from today's vantage point. I love it when people go back and write these think pieces about how such and such a thing from 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago it's not as good as we thought it was. Oh, it's problematic or whatever. Not even taking into consideration that things change throughout society. 20 years ago, there was not same-sex marriage. But if you're judging something now from a world that had same-sex marriage, and you're judging something, an artifact of a world that didn't, you can't sit there and go, see, this isn't as good as it should have been because they didn't believe in this at that time. Of course they didn't. Society's constantly in flux. It's constantly shifting. And to sit there and look back from today's perspective, it's something that was made decades ago, and judge it from this vantage point. I'm not saying you can't do that, but you can't then go and say, those people 20 years ago, they didn't know what they were talking about. Well, you know what? I'm here to tell you. Gladiator, Ridley Scott's 2000 Gladiator, released on May 5th, 2000, fucking rules. Gladiator fucking rules. It deserves every accolade it got. I fucking love Gladiator, and don't you ever diss Gladiator in my presence. Don't talk about... Anyway, not going to go off on a rant, but I am going to read 2 articles in The Guardian. One was printed yesterday, and the other was printed today. 2 articles about Gladiator in the same publication in the same 24 hours. So, first of all, I got to throw on my glasses because you know me in reading. Let's take a gander at these articles, shall we? This first one that was published in The Guardian yesterday, Gladiator 20, how Ridley Scott's epic rejuvenated the historical blockbuster. The Oscar-winning sword and sandals Russell Crowe vehicle refreshed old cliches before ushering in a spate of copycats. This was published, or it was written by Steve Rose, and it was published May 2020 at 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. Joey, do you like movies about gladiators? The creepy pilot asks the small boy in Airplane. To younger audiences, the joke no longer makes any sense. In Airplane's day, sword and sandals movies had become an outdated, unwittingly homoerotic joke. But then came Gladiator, and the joke was on us. Released 20 years ago this month, Ridley Scott's Roman epic, 20 years ago today, Ridley Scott's Roman epic gave the old cliches a new lease of life. It was all here. Colosseum action, rippling man-flesh, tigers, but Gladiator had its cheesecake and ate it. It served up crowd-pleasing spectacles and airline ad visuals, but also solemn, Oscar-worthy drama, and in retrospect, a fair degree of camp. Gladiator was one of the first movies to make use of CGI technology to recreate actual history rather than aliens and monsters. Its ancient Rome, packed with virtual crowds, looked like a video game at times, but back in 2000 it was groundbreaking. Others took note. Within a few years we had a mini Sword and Sandals revival. Troy, Alexander, King Arthur. By Zack Snyder's overblown 300, the genre had devolved back into parody, but it has never really gone away. Joaquin Phoenix's incestuous despot in Gladiator has a very Game of Thrones vibe to him, for example. Ridley Scott tried to repeat the original formula himself, first with the post-9/11 Crusades drama Kingdom of Heaven, which only proved that Orlando Bloom was no Russell Crowe, then with 2010's Robin Hood, which proved that Russell Crowe wasn't exactly his former self either. I would like to posit that, not pause this, but posit that Kingdom of Heaven, if you watch the much longer director's cut, is an incredible film in its own right. And again, I wonder if this writer even knows there's two versions of Kingdom of Heaven, as there's two versions, hell, of Gladiator. I actually prefer the longer version. In most of Ridley Scott's films, he has to cut them down for the studio, and he's been very accommodating. I think, in my mind, perhaps too accommodating. There's 2 cuts of Legend. There's 2 cuts of The Counselor. There's 2 cuts of Alien now. You know, there's 2 cuts of a lot of his movies. And there's 2 cuts of Gladiator, 2 cuts of King. It's just, I don't, yeah. Anyway, Gladiator was the pinnacle of Crowe's career. He won the Best Actor Oscar, but also the beginning of his transition from commanding Hollywood lead to grumpy, difficult diva. The way Crowe tells it, he rescued Gladiator, giving it his all on screen and whipping the awful script into shape off it. By the way, they didn't have a full script when they were making Gladiator. It was being written on the fly as they were making the film. So it's also a crazy story. You get the impression Crowe has thought of himself as the boss ever since. Hence the stories of bad behavior, the irritable press interviews, the abortive second career as a rock star. He's mellowed somewhat recently, using his menace to good effect in The True History of the Kelly Gang and as Roger Ailes in The Loudest Voice. But the steady ascent of Joaquin Phoenix's career is a study in contrasts, and perhaps ego management. Phoenix tends to disappear into his characters. Crowe's real-life persona often overshadows his. Now, Gladiator is ancient history itself, but in some ways, its story is more relevant now than it was then. An undeserving despot who hijacks a mighty empire and betrays its principles, who sidelines the wise politicians and distracts the citizens from his corruption with violent populist spectacle. Fear and wonder, a powerful combination. As Derek Jacobi's sideline senator puts it, Gladiator both served it up and warned us against it. Well, yeah. I mean, that was the point. I mean, the whole, the funny thing about Gladiator is how many people were turned on to Marcus Aurelius because of Gladiator, because of Richard Harris's performance. Oliver Reed's great performance as Maximus's master, who obtained him. I guess he didn't buy him, he obtained him. Maybe he did buy him, into the gladiatorial games. I mean, these are things that I'm going to turn my light on. I can't believe I haven't had my lights on this whole time. The show's not as festive. And it should... Oh, see? Oh, well. Oh, well, maybe it'll come on. Maybe it won't come on. What can I do? It's just a loose plug. But anyway, this idea that, it's very funny how a movie is a movie. And I believe that works of art are... They stand the test of time, they exist, but we're always trying to change the actual work of art based on what happens throughout history to the people that created that work of art. Now, when Gladiator was made, Russell Crowe was in a position as the lead of the film where he had to do whatever he could to make sure the movie was as good as it can be. And if you watch the documentaries on the making of the film, it was a difficult process. They didn't have a great script. in place. They were writing it as they went, and Ridley Scott was staging these elaborate action sequences because he knew that would be part of the draw of the movie. But really, again, the end product turned out to be something quite unique, and it sort of exceeded the sum of its parts. And for all of the tumultuous craziness that happened when they were making the film, the creative artists and artisans that worked on that movie made something great, something that's wildly entertaining, something that has probably a lot more depth than it deserves to have, but it's there. I mean, it's Connie Nielsen is terrific. Joaquin Phoenix is terrific as Commodus. Commodus, has there ever been? There's a scene where he sticks his tongue out at the violence. It's such a great moment. And, you just don't get enough of that in life. And I think that for what it was and when it was made, it certainly stands up as a great pinnacle of what is possible under difficult circumstances, that sometimes the craziness of making movies, sometimes, not every time and probably not most of the time, but the craziness that happened in the making of this movie certainly added to the final product, and it went on to entertain people. There's a moment in that movie that everybody remembers where a disgusted Maximus, who has had everything torn away from him, including his beloved father figure, Marcus Aurelius, by the evil machinations of Commodus, when he finally finds himself pit fighting for the rich and the unwashed masses, he says at one point, "Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?" And we, as the audience, are put into the very position of those people that are screaming for blood and spectacle. Yes, we were entertained, and we still are entertained. And I love Gladiator. I think it's a great example of populist, fun filmmaking. And now, let's read the article that The Guardian published today about Gladiator. It's a little longer, but it's another op-ed think piece that we read so much about. Believe me, the ones about The Empire Strikes Back are coming in the next couple of weeks, kids, and we'll examine those too. Because remember, Empire Strikes Back's not as good as, it's not the best Star Wars movie, and when it came out 40 years ago, it was very divisive amongst critics and fans. No, it wasn't. But anyway, here we go. Here was what was in today's Guardian. Did Gladiator really deserve the Best Picture? Scott Tobias wrote this, and it was published at 3:35 Eastern Daylight Time. I guess that would mean it was published at, 12:30 our time? When Gladiator was released in early May 2000, there wasn't much of an inkling that it would go on to win the Oscar for Best Picture, for the obvious reason that it was positioned as the first of the summer blockbusters, promoted less for its historical gravitas than its bloody combat in digitally enhanced coliseums. In retrospect, it shouldn't have been a surprise that 2.5 hours of speeches, montages, and decadent pageantry would fit into a broadcast that's an hour longer and slightly less violent. But the Best Picture designation has been an odd stain on Gladiator's reputation over the years. A film that might have been remembered as a satisfying revenge spectacle instead looks like a second-rate prestige picture. 20 years later, perhaps it's time to take Gladiator back to its original framing, not as the spoiler to Steven Soderbergh's unlikely coronation as a Hollywood director. His Aaron Brockovich and Traffic were both Best Picture nominees, and he won Best Director for the latter, but as a classed-up underdog sports movie, like a middle-period Rocky sequel in sandals and tunics. The palace intrigue that follows the death of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius may give the film a certain amount of sophistication, as do the performances by Russell Crowe, Joaquin Phoenix, and Connie Nielsen, who all make excellent and multi-layered contributions. Yet this is essentially about an undersized warrior gutting his way to a title bout. All else seems like window dressing by comparison. Really? Really, that's what you get? The competitive arc of Gladiator is Rocky III leading into Rocky IV. It's about our hero first belting his way through a colorful array of opponents, barrel-chested goons, armor-plated archers on chariots, man-eating tigers emerging from the arena floor, before finally battling the villain on hostile turf and turning the home crowd to his favor against the will of a brutal authoritarian government. Again, this is not the mark against the film because it mostly is rousing on these terms, boosted by a Roman succession plot that plays one man's epic revenge quest to the highest of stakes. But the argument that the film is any deeper than the red meat savagery it delivers doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Really? It doesn't? I think that you're wrong. And I think also the idea that the emperor was slain, that this was a palace coup, that the political machinations of what's going on in this film and everybody's lives who are at stake, Connie Nielsen and Connie Nielsen's son, the fact that everybody is now living in fear. This is not just about a title bout. This is about a responsibility to take back a government that has been usurped by a fucking douchebag. That is as much a part of the plot of this movie as the spectacle is. And to not acknowledge that, I think, is a mistake. Just because the spectacle is so great doesn't mean the rest of the movie isn't there. And it's not like it's in the shadows. I mean, it's there. Especially if you watch the longer version. Derek Jacobi has a bigger role. The Roman senators have a big role. People are taking risks trying to help Maximus. I mean, this is about not one man's revenge, but it's also about Rome as an empire versus a republic. It was supposed to become a republic again. That was Marcus Aurelius's wishes. Anyway. Red meat savagery it delivers doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's a terrific summer movie and one of the new century's least deserving Best Picture winners. By whose estimation? For director Ridley Scott, it started a run of enervating historical action dramas that included Kingdom of Heaven, Robin Hood, and Exodus, Gods and Kings, none of which had the same propulsive kick. The benefit of Crowe's Oscar-winning lead performance and a script by David Franzoni, John Logan, and William Nicholson that was geared around it is that he makes it impossible to get lost in the hectic atmosphere Scott conjures here, from hundreds of extras, digital landscapes, and assorted period bric-a-brac. There's a lot to draw the eye away from the central action in Scott's films. Orlando Bloom, for example, doesn't have the presence to draw focus in Kingdom of Heaven. Again, have you seen the director's cut? But Crowe's General Maximus Decimus Meridius has a simple and well-defined mission, and the actor plays it as righteous as a sword plunged straight to the hilt. Contrasting the scorched earth of Germania, where Maximus leads his men in one final push against the barbarians, "At my signal, unleash hell," with the golden fields of home where his wife and son await after his years away, Gladiator begins with the patriot's humble request. In exchange for his service to the Empire, he wants a little time off. Those fields ain't going to harvest themselves, you know, but he gets caught up in circumstances beyond his control. The dying Marcus Aurelius wants him as a placeholder to boost the Senate and lead Rome toward democratic rule. But that means passing over his vile, sadistic fail-son, Commodus, who craves the unfettered power of an emperor and unnaturally shortens his father's life to get it. Commodus condemns Maximus to quiet execution in the forest, orders his family murdered, and sets about engineering the dissolution of the Senate and a comprehensive quashing of dissent. When Maximus is picked up by slavers in Zuccobar, a Roman city that would now be in Algeria, and he's forced to battle to the death alongside other gladiators, first in local events and later in the Colosseum, where he becomes a sensation. The fun irony is that the feckless Commodus has brought the gladiators to Rome as a bread and circus' initiative to distract the great unwashed while he seizes total authority over the empire. Just his description is proving my point. That all of these political machinations are just as much of a plot of this film, or part of the plot of the movie, as the great gladiatorial combat scenes. Now, with Maximus besting all comers in front of lusty boo-birds turned superfans chanting his name like the Soviets rooting for Rocky, Commodus' hold on the throne is becoming more tenuous. You know, before Rocky III and before Rocky IV, Rocky himself, Rocky won Best Picture. Just want to point that out. Phoenix is a wonderfully hissable villainous Commodus, a legacy brat who understands his own absence of nobility and honor as liberating qualities. Like any good tyrant, he sees a clean conscience as a terrible obstacle to his ambition. But most of the behind-the-scenes complexity comes courtesy of Nielsen as Lucilla, Commodus' sister and Maximus' former lover, who acts with political expediency in order to survive, but asserts herself firmly in the shadows. There's another part of this movie where women had to keep their place and how they were constantly in fear, even though she's part of the royal court, the emperor's court. She can get killed by her brother, who has his own designs on her at any moment. So can her son. It's got that element woven into it as well. Lucilla is a glimpse into what Gladiator might have been if its priorities were directed more towards the machinations of government rather than the machinations of separating men's limbs or head from the rest of his body. But then it wouldn't have been called Gladiator, would it have? The fact that it's in a movie called Gladiator is why the movie is so special. The action sequences in Gladiator dance right on the edge of coherence, which may have something to do with the difficulty of matching live action with digital backdrops, but mostly falls in line with popular action directors like Michael Bay or Scott's brother Tony, who were favoring movement and viscera over the nuts and bolts of clear blocking. Bruh, you try and shoot some of those sequences. Anyway. When Maximus is battling an undefeated, chest-thumping Hulk twice his size named Tigris, and actual tigers appear in support, it becomes obvious that we're being treated to a bread and circus' gore fest along with the Roman commoners. Yes, exactly. And once you come to that realization, Gladiator no longer seems like a bid for respectability. It had respectability imposed on it. This kind of stuff, this is, to me, the most annoying kind of film commentary that you can possibly read. Because we've had so much since then. Everybody wants to look back and be like, oh, this movie was going for something that isn't really there. But it is really there. He just described what it was and talked about what it was. I mean, these are all things that were imbued into the film to make it what it is. You can't then turn around, mention all this stuff in your review, and then say, but all of that stuff really wasn't there. It is a frothy mix. Of course it's about the visceral thrills of gladiatorial combat. Of course it is. I mean, that's what makes it fun. I love I, Claudius, which is one of my favorite things that's ever been on TV. And in I, Claudius, they actually go and watch gladiatorial combat, but since they couldn't afford to do it on a TV budget, you never see it. The camera never even turns around. You're only ever seeing the people watching the gladiatorial combat, and you hear the sound of combat in the distance. And it's just, I look at these kinds of things and I read these kinds of reviews and I'm like, wow, it's easy to look back and write. I mean, that would be like complaining about movies that were only ever in black and white back in the day. I mean, if only movies like, Night of the Hunter that we talked about on Liz Reviews, if only Night of the Hunter could have been shot in color, it would have been so much more palatable to modern audiences. I mean, come on, man. These kinds of think pieces, I keep reading. It's almost like modern generations when they look back and things were already deemed classics before they were able to get there and watch them themselves and able to weigh in. They're never going to weigh in and go, yeah, legit, straight up good. I mean, I find that genre cinema gets a little bit more respect, especially, give it up for the horror fans who can go back and watch a lot of classic horror movies from back in the day and be like, yeah, that was good. I understand. I respect that. But you have a movie like Gladiator. It's so easy to make fun of because is there something wrong with visceral thrills? Are people going to start talking about that Silence of the Lambs didn't deserve its best picture because, it's just two people talking between a pane of glass or a pane of bulletproof plexiglass or whatever, that there's really not much there? I mean, it's just two people talking, quid pro quo, Clarice. I mean, seriously, it's such a... Gladiator is visceral, fun, entertaining filmmaking. And, Sasha Stone, who has her own... She reviews films. She's been on the Oscar beat for decades. had a really interesting point to make about the what people are saying about Gladiator. And that, remember, when you're voting for Oscars, it's a consensus of all of the different people that are part of the Academy and all of their different agendas and points of view. So what you end up getting when you get a Best Picture winner is perhaps maybe not the film that is most deserving, as some might say, but it is a consensus vote. It's what everybody's votes, with all of their differing points of view, lead you to. So in a way, usually the Best Picture winners are, perhaps not all the time, but maybe from a populist standpoint, they represent a great cross-section of all movie watchers. Anybody that, loves things like that. And I think that's important. And I think Gladiator is a movie that has lost none of its power. Sure, are some of the shots of Rome a little, like it was pointed out in this article, a little video gamey? Well, yes, but that is because special effects have advanced. But that's like saying, gosh, I can't watch Jason and the Argonauts anymore because the skeleton battle looks a little too stop-motion-y now, which is probably true. But that's not a failing of the movie, because when the movie was made, that's the technology that was available. And if you think back, if you watched, when I watched Jason and the Argonauts when I was a little kid, I couldn't tell the difference. All I knew is that skeleton battle was one of the coolest things I had ever seen. Did I notice the wires on the Martian war machines in War of the Worlds? Sure. Did it bother me? No, because it was rad. It was awesome. And these think pieces, when they go back and they try and, it's just not that good. No, you know what? You're not that good. You're not that good. And you write articles like this. Why are you writing articles like this? Are you going to diminish all the work people did that 20 years ago won the Best Picture Oscar? Are you going to diminish Russell Crowe's performance because of what happened to him after he made a movie? Because of what his life became later? What does it have to do with the work that he did on the film at the time? Nothing. Nothing. I love Gladiator. I don't know if it's in my top 10, but I'll tell you one thing. It's an HBO test movie. It passes the HBO test. Whenever I run across Gladiator playing on TV, I have to watch it, even though I own 4 copies. I'll sit in bed rather than get up and walk the 5 feet or whatever, 6, 7, 8 feet over to my shelf that's still there. The G's are still in our room, and I will take down Gladiator and watch it, or I'll just sit and watch it on TV, even if there's commercials. I love Gladiator. I'm not saying you should, but Maximus Decimus Meridius, he's the James T. Kirk of that era of Roman history, if he was a real guy. I'd follow him into this life and the next. Anyway, I just want to talk about Gladiator. It's the 20th anniversary of Gladiator, and I fucking love Gladiator. And reading these kinds of think pieces, it's just one of my pet peeves. I read these things, and I'm like, why are you taking down Gladiator? What's Gladiator ever done to you? Why don't you like Gladiator? Gladiator kicks ass. Do you have no heart? It's like reading people trying to convince me that Empire Strikes Back wasn't as good. I'm like, brah, you weren't even born. I saw Empire Strikes Back 26 times in the theater. I know I've said that a million times on the show, but it's true. 8th seat, left side, front row balcony at the UA 150 Theater on 6th and Blanchard. Don't look for it. They blew it up. But it was one of my favorite theaters I'd ever been to this day in all the world. And when you tell me that, Empire Strikes Back wasn't that good, people didn't like it that much. No, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. and I'll say that. Ha ha ha. Anyway. So, yeah. Got some letters, got some comments, got things that you guys have to say. And so why don't I'm just going to start reading. And to think I wasn't even going to go on today. I was frustrated. I had nothing to talk about. I'm like, I have nothing to say. Look what happens. Oh, there's nothing better than ice water. Ice water might be my favorite drink. The colder the better. This comes from Twin Flicks. Rob, this is a short letter. We've been pondering this for a while now, and it gets pretty technical, but we thought we would ask. Get your opinion on it. With the move to full-frame camera sensors like the Arri Alexa LF and the Red Monstro, do you have an opinion on whether we or he, I don't know who he is, whether he would rather use a lens 1.4 times longer than we would have with Super 35, or use the same focal length as you always have and just move the camera closer to the subject to compensate? That is a very interesting question. Here's the thing. a full frame sensor does not work. A full frame sensor with a lens, it's all got its own quality. It really depends. It really depends how the glass, it doesn't, like, what lens are you using? Are you using something that's spherical? What kind of a lens are you using? It honestly depends, and I don't think that there's an easy answer to that question. And again, you'd have to look at the sensors and see what it is you're trying to accomplish, and you will have to get the right tool for the job. You know, you can't just lock yourself into one thing or another. It really depends. What if you're using anamorphic lenses? How would that work? So I can't, not being a cinematographer myself, I am certainly not qualified to answer that question. However, I would say it really is, I would take it on a case-by-case basis. You know, when you're going for the look of a movie, when you pick a look, lenses and cameras are also part of that. So rather than, you're talking about a specific shot, but if you're going for an overall specific look, what you're using, which camera you're using, which sensor you're using, how you're going to light the film, what you want to do, it all plays into that. And that is something that a director and a cinematographer can work a long time on to get what they want. But it is a good question. Is that something you're going to ask Dean Cundy? Because I would love to hear his answer to that one. So yeah, I think that's a good question, though. I mean, I would love to hear a cinematographer's answer to that question. This next letter comes from Dean Mikitich. Dean Mikitich, one of our oldest, dearest members of the Post-Geek Singularity. Dear Rob and the PGS, the other day you mentioned you worked on a film back in the early 2000s that has never been realized. This was due to a legal issue with the band that appeared in the film and has blocked the film from being released. This got me thinking, how many films are sitting on shelves waiting to be released? I know there won't be too many, or if any, blockbuster films, and more likely to be low to mid-level budget films. I remember reading a few years ago that 2 of Chris Hemsworth's films had been shelved. He had made both of these films before making it big, and it was just after he left the Australian TV show Home and Away. These films are Cabin in the Woods and the remake of Red Dawn. I can't remember why both of these films had been shelved, but I think it was due to MGM and its bankruptcy. Red Dawn also had another issue. The invading army had been originally filmed as Chinese. With MGM now getting financial help from a Chinese company, they were not too happy with this. Plus, the film would also never get released in China, with the Chinese being the villains, so it was changed to the North Koreans. That is true. They had to go and digitally change all the Chinese iconography and make it North Korea. I also think what helped these films get released was that by this point Chris Hemsworth was now a star, having appeared in Thor and Snow White and the Huntsman, and also had a small role in 2009 Star Trek. Absolutely. So they could use his name to bring in some audience members. So Rob, going back to my original question, how many finished films do you think are sitting on a shelf waiting to be realized for one reason or another? Secondly, as studios take out loans to get these films made, how do they pay off the debt if the films are not going to make it to the big or small screen? Or are they able to write it off as the budget is so small? Finally, if there are any films sitting on a shelf waiting to be released, do you think studios will release them to give themselves a chance to catch up on the time they've lost with the current crisis? Peace and long life, Dean M. Well, Dean, those are all very good questions. Yeah, you know, there are 2 films that I'm particularly proud of the work I did as an editor that have never seen the light of day. One is a movie called My 11th that my twin friends, Gary and Edmund Enton, wrote and directed. And it stars John Benjamin Hickey. And it's John Benjamin Hickey's won a Tony Award. He's a character actor that you would all recognize if you saw him. Maren Hinkle, who's the mom on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Mrs. Maisel's mom. And Dakin Matthews is in it, and it's one of the lead actors on Better Call Saul is in it. But the film, it was made for not a whole lot of money, but it's never really played festivals. It's basically about a day in the life of a serial killer played by John Benjamin Hickey, and I think it's a terrific movie. I worked on it for a year, and it's finished. But there's a few music rights issues, things that have changed since the movie was done. So the music rights issues have to be swapped out, and we have to fix those music rights issues before it can be released, because that's something that you have to do. This happens sometimes when you make movies. There are music rights issues that hold things up. And the other movie, Orion Walker, who's now an award-winning writer for video games, wrote and directed a movie called Don Quixote. And that was his first and only feature, and we made that 20 years ago. And it's been sitting on a shelf for 20 years because Orion, as Orion would tell me, he was a huge fan of, I think it's Robert Pollard, the lead singer of a band called Guided by Voices. Well, he loved Guided by Voices. He used to tell me that Guided by Voices was to him what Shatner was to me in Free Enterprise. So Guided by Voices is actually in the movie, and they play themselves. I mean, they play at a club that the climax of this movie takes place in, and it's basically about a college kid undergoing sort of a crisis of conscience, a crisis of he's an existential crisis, really. And I think it's a really lovely movie, and it's an homage to David Lynch. There's a lot of Lynchian imagery in the film and a lot of good music. And I worked again for a year on this movie as the editor and the post supervisor, and you suddenly get caught up. The management threatens you, and you're an indie producer, and suddenly there's nothing you can do with your movie. And it has been sitting here. It hasn't seen the light of day. And that's my own career. And these are two movies that I spent a year of my life on each one of those films, and they've never been seen. And I'm really proud of the editorial work I did, and I like both films quite a bit. And I'm still hoping to see both of them see the light of day at some point. But from a studio level, again, these movies were not they were still costly. Look, when you're trying to find even hundreds of thousands of dollars to make movies, it's still a lot of money. Somebody's got to put that money up, and I certainly don't have $100,000 lying around that I can just give to somebody to make a movie. So it can be it can be tough, and it's also work I did that is unavailable. Work that no one's going to see. That's why we have The Hills Run Red coming out, and The Hills Run Red really, it's been on Vudu, but you haven't been able to get it on cable. It didn't have much of a berth. Not a lot of people know The Hills Run Red. I spent 3 years of my life getting it made and getting it out to the world. That's why it's so important to me when it comes out on Blu-ray, why I promote the fact that movie was, as you find out in the storytelling of the film on the Blu-ray, I wanted to produce a movie. I mean, I started out as the sole producer of that film, and I was able to flip it to a studio, which as a producer, I'd say that makes me a pretty good producer. But it came out, and so now it's coming out again, and it's great to be able to have people see it. And I don't think there's a lot of studio movies that wind up on the shelf. They usually get fixed somehow. For every movie like Supernova, they do get finished and they do get made. And so I think that you don't see a lot of that from the studio perspective, but it happens. I mean, it does in fact occur. But not much. But there's a lot of indie movies that never see the light of day for whatever reason. And it's a bummer. This next letter comes from Brian Cruz. Hey, Rob, long-time writer, but unfortunately I've not a long-time letter writer, but unfortunately I've not been able to write to you in a few months. Plus, I honestly don't think I've had anything worth writing to you about. That is, until this quarantine gave me the time to do something I know you will love, watching the entire Star Trek franchise. One of the earlier letters you took on your channel was for me just talking about my deep love for The Next Generation. It's one of my all-time favorite shows, and it has really affected me throughout the course of my life. I do like the original series as well, so sitting down and rewatching those during this stressful time was just a nice, fun ride. I have to be honest with you, though, I never watched any of the Star Trek shows past The Next Generation. Whenever I thought about watching another Star Trek series, I just decided I would rather go back and watch TNG again. That was a huge mistake, because I just finished one of the best television experiences of my entire life. Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Hear that, Willow Yang? I knew very little about Deep Space Nine before watching it, just that it was more serialized in its storytelling. Miles O'Brien from TNG comes to the show as a main character, and Worf joins the show after the third season, but that was it. So I went in fairly blind about what I was going to expect, and I ended up absolutely loving it. The first 3 seasons of Deep Space Nine were fine, but really it was the season 4 episode, the first episode of season 4, The Way of the Warrior, that really got me hooked. When the Klingon, the myth, the legend, Worf, son of Moog, joined the cast. Not just for the arrival of Worf, the episode itself is all around fantastic and ended up being my favorite in the whole series. After that episode, I became obsessed. I watched those last 4 seasons of Deep Space Nine in just 5 days. From 11 a.m. to 6 a.m. All I did was watch this show. I cannot believe I let myself go so long without giving this amazing series a chance. It might even be better than The Next Generation. This has to be one of the most underrated television shows ever. Doing some research, I found out it was pretty much a flop at the time of its production, even on good weeks only getting half the viewership that TNG averaged. And thanks to the TNG Blu-rays selling poorly, DS9 will most likely never get its own HD remaster, but at least it appears that there are a ton of people like me out there today, discovering this amazing show and realizing what they were missing out on. Up next is Star Trek Voyager, and I'm going into it knowing even less than I knew about Deep Space Nine. Looking forward to it. Best wishes, Brian Cruz. Well, Brian, I'm glad you got to experience that. How cool is that you did, in fact, get to experience it? We all love Deep Space Nine. To know it is, in fact, to love it. At least I'd like to think so. Let's see. There was somebody's chat from yesterday I wanted to read. Oh, yeah, it was Alexander Wilson's. Well, I was talking about Creed yesterday, and Alexander wrote this in after the show. I didn't read it. I think it came in after I read it. Alexander Wilson says, "You have to remember nobody had faith in Creed. They couldn't get funding to finish the film. Stallone said one of the executive producers took out a second mortgage to fund the finishing of the film. Also, I don't think anybody working on Star Wars has Ryan Coogler's talent." That could very well be true. I didn't know that. I didn't know that about Creed. I didn't know. I mean, I'm always holding up Creed and what Ryan Coogler did in Creed as a perfect example, perhaps the most shining example. And I was thinking about it even today on the John Campea show. Stallone talked about doing another Demolition Man movie. And I said, if you want to do another Demolition Man movie, all you have to do is look at Creed for the template. I mean, you can still have Stallone's character. Now he's in his 70s and someone else is unfrozen and is young. And for whatever reason, maybe there's a whole terrorist organization that gets unthawed. And the one guy that knows they're out there goes to Sylvester Stallone's character because he's the only person that would understand what this guy has to say. And it becomes, they team up to go after this, say, group of terrorists or something like that. I think Creed is a great example of how you introduce a new character that's part of the mythology of a franchise, but you honor the old character by making the Rocky Balboa character just as integral to the plot and to the coming-of-age story that you're telling. And I think it's a wonderful example of how to do that. And the first thing I heard when I was like, oh, they're going to make a Demolition Man movie, I'm like, they're going to follow the Creed formula. And they should. They should. Because that's the way to do it. This is how we do it. Yeah, I would do it that way. Let's see. Paul Gilmore sends in a tip and says, Rob, buddy, after a full month of waiting, I have finally received the Possession Mondo edition, and my God, this thing is beautiful, worth every penny. It is. I mean, if you like Possession, the way to go is that Mondo case, because it's got that black velvet, but it's blue velvet. It's like the color of this shirt, actually. A little darker, my Dr. Manhattan shirt. That's some good stuff. Good stuff. Paul Gilmore goes on to say, the last whining about movies, you ranted on Rennie Harlan, and I agree with everything you said. However, I do think Cliffhanger is an exception. It has some beautiful shots, fun action scenes. Sure, there are parts that don't hold up, but overall, it's a good one. I was hard on Rennie Harlan. I mean, as a studio director, there are worse people that I've seen. I just think that a lot of his shot choices are a little incongruous. I don't know if they're the best, but I do like some of his movies. I mean, I don't hate Die Hard 2. It doesn't hold a candle to the first one, and I do like Cliffhanger. So, yeah. Willow's here, and Willow sends in a tip and says, when it comes to the so-called murder hornets, I'm actually more concerned for the bees here. While hornets don't usually sting people unless their nests get disturbed, just 40 or 50 of them can easily slaughter an entire hive of bees. Well, that's what people are saying, is that the murder hornets, the most dangerous element of the murder hornets arriving in North America, are what they can do to bee populations. The last things bees need right now are real predators as opposed to pesticides. I mean, that's not good. We don't want our bumblebee friends to have any other. We got to get rid of those murder hornets. Those things they're scary as hell. Like, I remember being scared of. I was terrified of bees when I was little. But as an adult, they don't bother me at all. But murder hornets, man, get those things away. They're like the kaiju of flying insects. They're dangerous. They're like Rodan. But Rodan, I'd rather hang out with Rodan than a murder hornet. Yeesh. Stubble McShave sends in a tip and says, Gladiator was the last of the successful historical epics. It belonged to an era of Braveheart, The Last of the Mohicans, and Glory. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's really tough to make a historical epic that is interesting, and I think that's what Gladiator's great. The fact that it worked so well, and yeah, it used its pomp and circumstance, and it used its bloody spectacle of the gladiatorial battles to get people in there, but also, again, it made people interested in Marcus Aurelius, and it made people interested in that era again, and what went on. And I think there's, especially in the longer version where there's a lot more of the court intrigue and things like that. Why not? It's a good movie, and I really enjoy the film quite a bit. Throg won Best Picture sends in a tip and says, this person must be upset that Coyote Ugly didn't win. Well, Throg, you might be right there, because Coyote Ugly, man, who can forget that? Do It for Cash sends in a tip and says, been reading up on Kurosawa, and I can't believe I hadn't thought of this earlier, but along with the title Viceroy of Verisimilitude, I would like to also dub the Inquisitor of Immaculate Realities. Ooh, the Inquisitor of Immaculate Realities. I like that. I have to write that down. I'm going to have to be reminded of that. The Inquisitor of Immaculate Realities. Is that something that hang on, you know what I'll do? Since you wrote it, I'll find out what does that mean? Let me run it through this newfangled contraption called the internet. And you said you were reading up on Kurosawa. Was that something that Kurosawa? I don't recognize that as something that Kurosawa said, but hang on. Let me see. Inquisitor of Immaculate Realities. Well, no, it goes to immediately the Inquisition, and I know what that is. Inquisitor. Let me put some quotes around it. So, which is what I should have in the beginning. Nope. Inquisitor of Immaculate Realities. I'll take it. Though. I think I'll have to look into that and find out where that comes from. Stubble McShave sends in a tip and says, there's supposedly a porn version of every major movie. I'd heard the one for Gladiator was called Glad He Ate Her. Maybe Vesna or Willow can tell you more about it. Yeah, Gladiator, that's kind of funny. I'd love to see the logo. It doesn't sound like it's a good version of a porn film, but all right. You got to give it up for their creativity. Give it up for the creativity. Let's see what we got here. This one, our old friend Enterprise H, NCC 1701H is here. Derider of the Dark. Greetings. I'd already mentioned this in a previous letter, which you did not read on air, but the letter regarding cyberpunk prompted me to write this again. Star Trek does not suppose that a positive vision came magically about. We have the eugenics wars, the Bell riots, World War III, the Earth-Kazin wars, the Xindi attack, and the Earth-Romulan war, with the Federation being the light at the end of the grim dark tunnel. It is perhaps best summed up in Per Aspera et Astra, through hardships to the stars. Never forget, Star Trek held out the carrot, but the stick was ever in the background, as it was when Picard talked about Earth's nuclear winter, when the Enterprise D was sent to assist a colony and had to weigh whether to risk igniting the planet's atmosphere. In the words of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, "Man, thou whose rights are here declared, be no longer forgetful of the loftiness of thy destination. Think of thy rights, of those possessions which will give thee virtue and wisdom, by which thou mayest arrive at happiness and freedom. They are declared to thee by one who knows thy dignity, for every hour does his heart swell with honorable pride in the contemplation of what thou mayest attain, by one who is not forgetful of thy degeneracy, for every moment brings home to him the better conviction of what thou art. Awake, arise, or be forever fallen." Ooh, I like that. I agree with you. I do agree with you. But I've always thought that Earth is always going through a crucible. To be humanity is to travel through crucibles, one after another, and come out better, hopefully, on the other side. John Ryan is here. John Ryan says, "Dear Rob, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I haven't always been, but I am now, especially since the build-up to Episode 7, which I love. Episode 8, not so much, but to have the complete set, I still bought Episode 8 on DVD and recently tried to rewatch it, and I couldn't. I'm not going to jump on the Rian Johnson bashing train, but solely from a canon viewpoint, here's just one problem I have with this movie. Luke enters Ben's bedroom while the boy is sleeping, so now Luke is Herbert from Family Guy. Creepy. He senses the darkness in his nephew's dreams and thinks, should I, A, call my sister and ask her to come help train her son to set him on the right track again, B, call my best friend to come and help sort out Ben's daddy issues, C, call Lando, a parent himself that I've sought out Sith bounty hunters with in Episode 9, for some advice, or D, ignite my laser sword and kill a defenseless child while he sleeps in bed. Luke, who not only saw the good in Darth Vader, who had spent 2 decades in the dark side, slaughtering younglings, wiping out the Jedi Order, stood by while an entire planet was blown up, amongst other things, but who, in the comic Vader, realized his son, loved him. Even after everything he did, Luke loved him, and having defeated him, refused to kill a defenseless Vader. But this sleeping boy got the death sentence for having some bad thoughts? Also, Anakin, having defeated Dooku and executed him, said, I shouldn't have done that. It's not the Jedi way, because Jedi don't kill defenseless enemies. Obi-Wan, having defeated Vader and leaving him defenseless on Mustafar, didn't kill him. It's not the Jedi way. There is no way Luke Skywalker would choose option D. Why? It's not Luke's way. It's not the Jedi way. Thanks for letting me have my little rant. I love the show. Johnny from Sci-Fi Ireland, pronounced sci-fi. Sci-Fi Ireland. Is Ireland sci-fi? Ireland's the place one of the places I've most wanted to go in my life, and I have yet to get there. Our daily letter from Omar is here. Omar 1194. Omar 94. Hi, Rob. I wanted to give more recommendations for movies I really like that I think are underappreciated for you, your moderators, and the viewers. The first one I brought up some time ago, but I'm not sure how many have seen it. So this first recommendation I have is Ivan Reitman's Dave, with Kevin Kline, Sigourney Weaver, Frank Langella, Ving Rhames, Ben Kingsley, and Charles Grodin. It's very Frank Capra-esque, written by Gary Ross, co-writer of Big. Dave is not a movie people bring up when discussing Ivan Reitman, such as Ghostbusters, Twins, or Kindergarten Cop, but I think Dave is his second best film. My second recommendation is Billy Wilder's The Fortune Cookie from 1966, with Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. Matthau earned his only Oscar from this movie. It also has an appearance from the actor who plays Floyd the Barber from The Andy Griffith Show. My third recommendation is a 1946 film noir called Gilda, which is so good, which they're watching in The Shawshank Redemption, with Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford. Oh, it's the movie shown in The Shawshank Redemption, when the men cheer in the prison theater after Haywood flips her hair. Gilda, are you decent? Me? It was directed by Charles Vidor, who made another movie with Hayworth called Covergirl from 1944 with Gene Kelly, and Farewell to Arms in 1957 with Rock Hudson. My final recommendation I'm mixed on, as I'm not sure it's truly underappreciated, but it's Alfred Hitchcock's Rope with James Stewart. Hitchcock truly is the master of suspense, as this is the most suspenseful movie I have ever seen. And it takes place entirely in one room. It was shot in a way that makes it look like one continuous shot. According to Roger Ebert, who gave it 2 stars, Hitchcock himself felt the movie was an experiment that didn't work out. I really like it, though, and I think it's brilliant. Thanks, and live long and prosper. I love it hearing when you guys are giving me recommendations. It's always, I think, a good thing. Koba, I haven't heard Koba. Hi, Rob. Sorry, been a long time. But I decided to go traveling at the worst time possible, and long story short, I ended up with the virus. I'm better now, though. Well, Koba, it's good to have you back. My favorite simian, you know? I wondered, you know, when you do these shows, like, I don't expect... It's weird when you're on YouTube because you get audiences, and they ebb and flow. They come and go. You can't expect audiences to stick with you 100% of the time, I mean, especially when you're on every day. And now, with everybody going onto YouTube, there's a lot of people vying for eyeballs. And I'm just happy to have an audience of you guys that are here and you're supporting the channel and you are supporting each other. And the Post-Geek Singularity is growing and thriving still. And so I do not take the audience I have for granted. But I don't sit there and go, where did Koba go? But I think it. And I was wondering where you went because you've been around for a long time and then people go away. I'm like, I always think to myself, did I offend somebody? You know? I mean, I was accused because of my... interview with Brian Fuller on my channel. I was just straight up slammed. Somebody said I was a homophobe, and I was like, and they didn't like the way I was talking about gay sexuality. I'm like, wait, what? It was so strange. You just never know. You might say something that pisses somebody off, and they have no obligation to tell you why. They can just leave. And I always wonder. I always think like, oh, I hope I didn't piss anybody off. You know, because the implication, you always want to be liked. When you're putting yourself out there and talking to people, you hope you don't piss people off. And I would hope to open up that I have an open forum that anybody can bring their grievances to me. And if I have said something that pissed you off, I would hope that anybody feels like they could take it up with me, and I would give you a fair shake and not ridicule you. But anyway, you never know. So Koba, it's good to have you back. It's good to have you back. Don't fall from any high towers like they had you do on that second Planet of the Apes movie. Mike, Journey's End, sends in a 3-parter. People who dislike Discovery and Picard often say Star Trek needed a modern makeover to adapt to the times. But when thinking about it, I think a true modern adaptation of Trek would look and feel more like Black Mirror than Kurtzman's flashy action-adventure schlock. Star Trek was always closer to sci-fi horror than action-adventure. It's what fueled the self-contained episodes where the crew encounter a strange new phenomenon or civilization and slowly discover that there's something off that they need to grapple with. This isn't an argument for self-contained storytelling, although I'd prefer it, but just that a Black Mirror like Star Trek would feel more modern and true to Trek than the Star Trek-flavored mindless action-adventure we've been getting since 2009. Well, Mike, as you might imagine that gets from me, those comments get from me. You and I, sir, park our shuttlecraft in the same shuttle bay. I agree. I think that Star Trek has become monumentally dumbed down. I mean, the whole purpose of Star Trek is to explore ideas. And look, even like in a movie we talk about Gladiator, Gladiator has a lot of substance in it. And what's interesting is the substance is there, and when you see it, the conversation Maximus has with Marcus Aurelius, when he talks about a whisper that is Rome and all of that. These are great moments. Star Trek now and Kurtzman's background is coming out of action-adventure and things like that, and I get it. But Star Trek was never about that. Star Trek episodes posed questions that had moral and ethical implications, and then the actions of the Enterprise crew addressed those moral and ethical implications. And you would examine a problem usually from that perspective. Sure, there were times when there was shooting and that there was force involved, but it was always in the service of larger issues. And I feel like those issues, they get paid lip service to. People, it's very funny to me. People are always throwing, what about this episode at the end of the first season of Discovery when she's giving a speech? I'm like, she's giving a cliche Star Trek speech. And, that's kind of the way it works. But hey, yeah. So look, I agree. I think Star Trek has become a dumbed down, mindless adventure show, action show that bears little resemblance to what Star Trek really is. And it's very funny. Like, you get any, but I think the crux of the debate is there's a lot of new fans that are watching Star Trek over the last 10 years for the first time, and they've never seen anything like this before, and they like it for what it is because it retains enough of Star Trek's DNA that people now recognize, oh, there's something a little bit more going on here, because it is, in fact, a Star Trek show, even though you can't expect, Star Trek is 54 years old, and even I have always said pop culture has a 20-year half-life, and how can you expect somebody who was, say, born in 2000, and they were 16 or 17 when they first saw Star Trek Discovery, and they really liked it? I mean, maybe that was their first, as I said, their first experience with Star Trek, and there's enough there that they go, okay, I like this show. I mean, I can't expect them to go back and go back to the 60s. I mean, that would be like telling somebody who likes the new, pick your album, I don't know, the new Drake album, and if they really like that album, you can't go, you don't know what music is, popular music. You gotta go back and listen to, like, the first Genesis record, or the Rolling Stones, or the Beatles, or something. You can't like Drake as much as them. You can't have those conversations because that doesn't make any sense. People who are alive today, you can't expect them to go back in time and watch something of that time and get as much out of it as the people of the time, who got that much out of it back then, or as they grew up within a decade or two or three or four. I mean, we're now there's been 5 decades, and we're in the middle of the 6th decade where we've had Star Trek. And you can't expect people to go back decade after decade after decade, because I grew up with it. So, we have to be mindful. I don't like modern Star Trek since 2009. I think Star Trek has not been very good, and it's had limited appeal, and it's because the reason Star Trek hasn't been good in the last 10 years is they've tried to make Star Trek, which is a niche property, they've tried to make it appeal to the same kind of audience that Transformers, that Star Wars, that these much bigger franchises appeal to, because there's this thought that Star Trek can be a generic franchise just like these other franchises. But Star Trek is its own thing. It's like trying to make Fetch happen. Stop trying to make Star Trek happen. The only way you can make Star Trek happen is if it becomes a water cooler show once again that has the kind of writing that the only place you can find it is on Star Trek. And until that happens, until only Star Trek stories can be told on Star Trek, that you're not emulating 8,000 different TV shows, you're never going to succeed. They're trying to make Fetch happen with Star Trek, and it won't. It can't until it becomes unique again. Do It for Cash sends back, and it sends to me, he says, Kurosawa's thoughts on what he called immaculate reality is akin to Richard Donner's ideas on verisimilitude. Ooh. Well, you know what? I need to go read up on my Kurosawa, because that's really interesting. Kurosawa's... Yep, there it is. Popped right up. Wow. Well, the first thing that popped up is an article from The Verge. I don't know if this is what... I'm just going to read it anyway because it's interesting. This is how legendary director Akira Kurosawa made his films feel so alive. This is from March 23rd, 2015. It was written by Jacob Castronakes. Even if you've never seen an Akira Kurosawa film, there's a good chance that you've seen something inspired by him. That might be A Fistful of Dollars, which is based on Kurosawa's samurai film Yojimbo, or just a passing reference to Rashomon, his film about a story that everyone's telling a different version of. That influence has spread so wide because Kurosawa is one of the all-time greats in directing. One of the reasons why, as film editor Tony Zhao points out, is that Kurosawa had an incredible ability to fill his shots with an entire world of movement, from the actors to the background to the camera. The latest installment of his Every Frame a Painting series, Zhao breaks down how Kurosawa uses movement to tell stories and create images that are so deeply compelling. It's a fascinating watch that'll make you want to put on a Kurosawa flick as soon as you get home. I'm partial to Ron, but you really can't go wrong. Well, you know what? I'm going to put this. Wow, it doesn't have a. Well, hang on a second. Let me go to YouTube and get the link. I have not watched this video, but already I can see that it's right up my alley. I'm going to put it in the live chat. So here we go. There it is. This looks great, and woo, this video's got over 5 million views, and it was again put out March 19th. That's interesting. I will definitely go watch that. Alexander Wilson is here and sends in a tip and says, "You said you know all the astronauts by name." Oh, back when I was a kid. But did you know the integral background figures like Katherine Johnson, who taught at my alma mater? She also mapped and calculated the U.S. satellite system that birthed many modern-day technologies. No, I have to tell you, I didn't know Katherine Johnson until I saw Hidden Figures, which I really loved. I mean, I thought that was great. I didn't know. I didn't know the people that worked in Mission Control. I mean, it was hard to know that. I'm talking when I was a little kid. When I was a little kid, because I like 5, and I couldn't even begin to tell you all the astronauts now. But back then, it was the Apollo astronauts and the Mercury 7 and Gemini and all those astronauts. I really liked that. But no, I didn't know anybody who. Look, I've watched Hidden Figures like 6 times though. I love that film, and it's a really interesting period of time that we don't nearly shine enough light on about how many people participated in the American space program and were so integral to it. So yeah, I mean, there's just so many people. But yeah, I really did like seeing that Hidden Figures did that. It's interesting. I don't know if you saw, but they dropped a trailer for the new. They've made it. The Right Stuff is one of my favorite movies of all time, and now it's going to be on Disney Plus. But they've made a Right Stuff. I don't know if it's a mini series or an ongoing series, but I saw the trailer today, and it looks like they spent like 8 cents on it, which is really sort of too bad. I mean, The Right Stuff is one of my favorite films, and I was just watching the TV show. I'll watch it, but it was so interesting seeing the actors. I'm sure they're giving it their all, but it just didn't look that compelling. But who knows? Mike and Journey's End comes back and says, "It makes me realize that it's near impossible for a niche property to exist like it did in the 1980s. Just because a property isn't made for a mass audience doesn't mean it needs to be changed into one that is. Today it seems that's all that can get made." Well, yeah, I mean, the real problem is, as it always is, money. I mean, back in the day, I mean, in the 80s, movies, and remember, Terminator 2 was the first movie to cost $100 million. And that was in the early 90s. No one spent that kind of money on movies. And even a movie like Hunt for Red October, which to me is a big, sprawling studio film, it didn't cost anywhere near $100 million. And nowadays, the cost of these movies is so expensive, and everyone's getting a cut. There's so many different production companies. You've got 2,000 people in the effects team. These movies have just gotten so expensive to make that there's just too much money involved. And that's why the studios are releasing less diverse fare. And I don't mean diverse necessarily with people in them, but diverse in terms of subject matter. All we're getting is spectacle. Where before you could get a political thriller, or you could get a comedy, or you could get a horror film, or you get a science fiction movie, and they're all being released by the studios because they were spending, like in the 80s, Star Trek 2, for instance, early 80s, that was like an $11 million movie. And these movies, they were 11, 20, 25, 35, $40 million was an expensive film in the 80s. And there was a lot more, people understood that you would go to the movie theater and you'd see a New Line movie like Nightmare on Elm Street, or you'd see The Hidden. You'd go to a film like The Hidden, and B movies, Escape from New York, $4 million movie. It opened in theaters. People went and saw it. It was a hit. The Fog, $1 million. Halloween. People would go. Now, would anybody roll out to see movies like that in the theater? Now, when we go to the theater, we want these giant spectacle movies, and I think that's one of the real, unfortunately, one of the great problems that we have now, and that's Hollywood sort of painted themselves into a corner. They have to provide this kind of spectacle, and it has sort of, people have turned to streaming services when they watch long form. The reason people watch long form, more novelized programming, I think, is that it's far more fulfilling from an intellectual standpoint. When I say intellectual, you don't have to be an intellectual, but people want to watch stories that touch them, that move them, and stories that move people presuppose that they have to be smart stories. They have to have stories with the proper character development to actually create that emotional bond in the viewer, between the viewer and the characters on screen. And nowadays, these giant spectacle films, it's all shortcuts. They use storytelling shortcuts to make them all work. But when you go and you watch a show like an Ozark or like a Better Call Saul or any of the stories that you want, then that's why people are turning to streaming services, and that's why people love shows like Game of Thrones, and that's why the last season baffled me, because it's the last 3 episodes of Game of Thrones, I think, completely, as I was talking about the other day, it completely sort of ruined the rest of the series because it wasn't going anywhere. All those characters were done a great disservice. The story that you're following, it was very disappointing. Mike goes on to say Blumhouse should take over Trek. Only $5 million Treks from now on. Well, when you think about an episode of Star Trek Discovery costs, they say it costs like $8 million, but the first season you're looking at $15 million budgets, if not more. And that's crazy. And they didn't even tell one story in an episode. I don't even know if the people that are working on Picard or Discovery could tell you a decent story in 2 hours. I don't know if they know how to do that. I really don't. But I agree with you. I think, honestly, I think that there should be a series of Star Trek movies, and they should be making a Star Trek movie every 6 months or a year, and they make Star Trek movies that cost less than $50 million. And it can be done. It can be done well. You just have to know what you're doing. You have to have filmmakers that really understand how to make these movies, because Star Trek should never have to rely on spectacle and special effects to work. But I don't know if anybody would know that. I don't know if a studio executive would have the balls to greenlight that kind of a movie. They'd say to me, like, well, if let's say I was in a position to go in and pitch the story. If I said, look, man, I just want $50 million. They'd look at me like I was absolutely crazy. They're like, well, Rob, we can't make just a $50 million Star Trek movie. How are we going to market that? I'm like, why don't you wait and see if the movie's good first? And then we'll worry about marketing it. But yeah, I think Star Trek movies, I'll bet if you capped a Star Trek film at $50 million, I'll bet some filmmaker would go on and knock it out of the park. What you need is the Ryan Coogler of Star Trek to come along and reinvent it, make it reinvigorating for audiences, make it smart once again, if that's even possible. So, who knows? Well, ladies and gentlemen, another short show today. I got stuff I've got to do. I want to thank everybody for being here. This was Robservations episode 407. My God, I can't believe it's 407. I want to thank my moderating staff, of course, Mike Bodden. I want to thank. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm prematurely kicking myself off the channel because I realized I have a letter. I have one letter I didn't read yet, and I need to read this letter because why not? So I am not going to get off the air right now. I thought I was, but I didn't. See what I did there? This letter comes from our own Ian Samuels. And, of course, Ian Samuels is almost like Omar, writing a letter a day. Let's see. Rob and fellow Robservationists. As it was May the 4th yesterday, let's talk about Star Trek. Yes, I know, it's like a Will Wheaton joke. One of his appearances on The Big Bang Theory was going to see The Force Awakens, and he dressed as Spock from the original series and proudly announces, "Live long and suck it." Well, that's just about the level of Big Bang Theory, so I would buy that. So in honor of Star Wars Day, here I am to talk about the best written Star Trek ever, Discovery. Only joking, of course. I'm talking about Deep Space Nine. Both start with a D, but the similarity ends there. One example of how well-written DS9 is the character of Kira Nerys, which, incidentally, if that was Welsh and you translate it into English, it would translate to thoughtful lady. Originally, the idea was for Ro Laren, who appeared in Next Generation, to be a first officer, but Laren actress Michelle Forbes turned down the part, and so the writers created Kira Nerys. Kira ended up being one of the strongest characters with a powerful backstory in the entire series. A character along with Jadzia Dax, who are strong female characters which many female Star Trek fans found inspiring. Talking about Jadzia Dax, slick segue, Season 4, Episode 6 brought us Rejoined, and we discover that a previous Dax host was married to a previous host to a Trill symbiote named Khan. Jadzia finds herself having feelings for Lenara, a leader of a science team. This was considered groundbreaking as it showed a lesbian kiss on screen. It's a real shame that such a thing as homosexual romance and a colored lead were considered groundbreaking at the time. The only thing that it proves is how backwards general audiences still were in the 90s. Well, colored. That even sounds more anachronistic than the 90s. One of the things that stand out for Deep Space Nine is the subject matter they were brave enough to cover. No other series had covered the subject of war in the same way. Even Babylon 5 Shadow War, which was on our screens at a similar time, just used the normal sci-fi trope of fancy-looking spaceship battles, but little else. It tried to show the effect of loss, but this was still military forces dealing with the death of fellow soldiers, etc. In Deep Space Nine Season 3, Episode 5, Nor to Battle the Strong, which has us follow Jake Sisko as he's writing a piece on Dr. Bashir, but they get a distress call from an outpost that is being attacked by Klingons. Oh yes, spoiler, this is a time when the Klingons are the enemy again. The outpost is desperate for doctors. Jake is excited his story can be now more interesting as he gets to see medicine on the front line, but all too soon, we and Jake are hit by the realities of war, and it's not exciting, but instead Jake finds out it's terrifying. Never before, especially in sci-fi, have we seen the realities of war played out in such a realistic way. The closest would have been the most dramatic examples or episodes of MASH. That is the closest example I can think of. We later in the final season get episode 8, The Siege of AR-558. This is an important episode and one of the fan favorite characters, Nog, the first Ferengi in Starfleet. I want to say what happens in that episode because Willow, if she's watching right now, I don't want her to know what happens in that episode. So I'm going to skip that over. But I understand your point. It's not just an indication of the brilliant writing, but also of the great cast that the viewer is finding themselves caring deeply about what happens to these characters. Even when I rewatch the series now, I find myself crying seeing what that thing happens. Unless we find ourselves in such a situation, none of us can know how we would react. Will we be heroic, save people's lives while surrounded by explosions, or do we run and hide? Jake found out, but he may have been a coward in that terrifying moment. But he's brave enough to write about it and admit to everyone who reads it how he felt and how he reacted. I enjoyed Picard. I didn't like the Mass Effect plotline. I didn't like the swearing. The writing felt lazy. Discovery just has lazy and really poor writing. So if you like Star Trek and you want to see Star Trek done properly and written well, no, brilliantly, then go back and watch Deep Space Nine. You will laugh, you will cry, you will care about what happens to these characters. People still say DS9 is not Star Trek as it is set on a space station and they are not trekking, but the fact is that Deep Space Nine is not only Star Trek, but also Star Trek at its very best. Ian, how interesting. I can't believe I didn't read that letter, almost, because people are writing about DS9. I guess DS9 is in the zeitgeist, which is very, very interesting. But look, I agree with you, and I think one of the great things about Deep Space Nine is it did have a diverse cast. You know, it had a multi-ethnic cast from all over the world. It had great female characters, great male characters, great alien characters. And they cast it properly, and the idea of a diverse cast, it wasn't something that they were touting necessarily. It just worked for the show. You know, and it was really, really, really well done. And I think that's how if you want to take a lesson in how you do diversity correctly, it's Deep Space Nine, where you don't tout, look at my diverse cast. I mean, it's so interesting. In the 90s, nobody would say that. They just cast people. They just casted people they wanted to cast. But they didn't sit there and go, let's pat ourselves on the back for having diversity and all that. It's like, no, you shouldn't be patted on the back for that. You should just do it like The Expanse did, or like Deep Space Nine did, which I think is good. Uh-oh, Bob the Bard is here. Aha! Got here just in time to squeeze in another limerick in honor of my 2020 project. There once was a big king named Kong, whose feet were abnormally long. To make shoes that fit these, he used coconut trees, but these were good only for tongs. I don't know, Bob. I don't know, man. I'll keep reading them, but I think that one needs a little work. But all right, I'll give it to you. I chuckled on the inside. I did. Ladies and gentlemen, that limerick will take us out from Robservations episode number 407. Oh boy. I, of course, will be back tomorrow on the John Campy Show. I will be back here. We have another episode of Whining About Movies tomorrow night. I don't know what the movie is. I'm almost leaning toward doing the international version of Life Force, since the Richard did a Life Force watch party. I don't think Elizabeth has seen Life Force, and she wanted a movie that was full of goofy fun. And if ever a movie was full of goofy fun, it's Life Force. And I love Life Force, especially the 30-minute longer international cut of that movie. What's not to love? But I haven't decided yet. I want to thank my moderators. I want to thank Mike Bodden. I want to thank Detective Jim. I want to thank Greg Smith. I want to thank Jordy Lyons. I want to thank Louis Yu and the Richard. All of you contribute to make the channel and the surrounding elements, or every part of the channel, great. I also want to remind everybody, do not forget, Robservations, the Burnettwork, and, of course, Harman International have made it possible for us to give away the JBL Bar 9.1, which comes out to the general public on May 31st. It is almost $1,000 value. It is a soundbar with subwoofer and satellite speakers that has Dolby Atmos in it. And this was made possible by Harman International and Connie at their experiential engagement department. It was very nice of her. She's a fan of both this show and the John Campia show. And there is a link underneath in the description of this show. You can follow that link and you can enter. You can enter as many times as you like. I will be giving this away on my birthday, which is a week from Friday. Also, ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking into having a virtual birthday party via Zoom, where I think I can get up to 300 people. So after the show on Friday, we wouldn't have an Elizaviews, but Elizabeth and I would be here. I will have whiskey and wine. Maybe I'll have people in here. I don't know. But then 300 people could log in and we could just have a virtual birthday party. I don't even know what that's like. I don't know if it'll work, but I think I'm going to try it. So plan on that. May 15th, Friday, May 15th. I guess it would be, I don't know, Pacific time. I don't know what people would want to do, but I want to try it. But yeah, enter in to get this. It's very cool. I can't wait to give it away. And I want to thank Harman International, which is a subsidiary of Samsung and also JBL, for making this possible. Thank you, Connie. And enter the contest. How fun is that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this brings an end to Robservations episode number 407. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Hopefully, I will be dropping the David Goodman interview. He's the executive producer of The Orville, and he's also the president of the Writers Guild of America. I will hope to get that up today, and I'm hoping to have some more interesting interviews coming up, because people are really enjoying those, and I think I've been getting some really interesting inquiries, and we'll see what I can bring you in the future. I don't even have to have a 400th episode to do it. But anyway, Robservations 407, the show about something. Thank you, Imagination Connoisseurs. Thank you, members of the Post-Geek Singularity, for being here. Keep those letters coming, and thanks for supporting the channel in all of the ways that you do. And with that, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. That's all you have to do. And with that, I say, have a better day.